And I'm going to say welcome, folks, to the second of our online webinars in the series of events we're doing as part of the wider network, the Youth Disability Action and Research Network. I'm delighted to introduce Miro Griffiths from University of Leeds in the UK. We're really pleased to have him here for many reasons, but one is his research and the project that he and the network as well that he's leading is so similar to the interest of this network in terms of youth and disability and advocacy. We had to have him come and share some of his work. So he's going to talk about the research project he's been running from, I think, is it since 2020? And some of the results from that. He's also going to use that as an opportunity to start some conversations with you guys about your own reflections on similar things. So his first slide is an introduction to himself, so I won't repeat that. But what I will do is welcome Miro to the second webinar, and I'll hand over to you to do your presentation. If folks could just keep yourselves muted, and there'll be opportunity to use the chat, of course, and at various points Miro is going to stop and take some questions and comments, so we'll of course unmute you then. All right, over to you.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you very much. So hello everybody. I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me while I do that. So for those of you who can, I hope you can see the slides. I will be talking about what's on the slide, and any imagery I'll be describing as well. So the purpose of today and the invitation is to talk to you a little bit about young disabled people's experiences of activism, participation and resistance. And what I'm really quite interested in is how and why do young disabled people engage in activism and advocacy and campaigning, and what's the alternative ideas and imaginings that young disabled people have about the world in which they live in and the world in which they want to live in. So a little bit about who I am. So I'm a research fellow in disability studies. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term disability studies, at its most simplistic level, it's the study of disabled people's position in society. So thinking about the political, economic, cultural, social arrangements and structures in society that impact and affect disabled people's life chances and opportunities to be part of the communities they want to be part of. I'm also a deputy director of the Centre for Disability Studies in the University of Leeds. That's a research network across the university made up of activists and academics who are interested in disability studies. But I've also got, outside of academia, I've got a background in advising different bodies and groups on disability policy. So I spent a lot of time working with the UK government and the European Commission on disability policy, particularly in relation to how to ensure disabled people have choice and control over the support they receive, and how to ensure that they have what we sometimes refer to as self-determination. So making sure disabled people can choose how to live their life and how to ensure they have access to sufficient support to do that. And I'm also involved in many disabled people's organizations. And by that, I mean organizations that are run by and controlled by disabled people. So I spend a lot of time working and advising disabled people's organizations in the UK, which is where I'm based, and across Europe as well. So in terms of today, I think there's kind of three things I'm going to do as part of this presentation. We have an hour and a half. I'm going to hope that we can try and get the presentation in within an hour, and then I'll spend a little bit of time answering any questions or queries. But as Dan said, throughout this presentation, I'm going to take some pauses, and I've got some questions to ask people in the group. And if you're happy to respond, then you can use a chat or indicate some way. I think Dan will coordinate the responses, just to get some reflections on your experiences or people that you know in relation to the questions I ask. So I'll do a little bit about the research that I've been doing for the last 4 years, and I'll give you some kind of what we call data headlines. So what are the key findings coming out of the research, which I think are most interesting and relevant to this discussion today. And I'll give you my contact details at the end as well. And of course, I can't do it justice in terms of talking at length about all aspects of the project. I'm only going to give you a snapshot of it. So by all means, think of this as a start of a conversation where I'm happy for people to contact me and we can speak more about this. The other thing I would say is I'm conscious that this research is rooted in a European context. It's rooted in understandings of disability that come from the UK and Europe. And I'm never a fan of what we sometimes call transference or blueprint planning, which is where we say, well, this is happening here, so just take this and implement it everywhere in the world and it will work. That doesn't work. And I think it's disingenuous to the voices and experiences of people in their own localities and communities. So what I would like us all to do really is, as we progress through the findings of this project, take what you think is of interest to yourself and to your communities and think about what do the themes and the principles of which I found, how did they relate to and contextualize within your own localities? Because there'll be things that are much more significant and poignant and of interest to you that may not be the same in my own community as well. So it's thinking about how do the themes and principles that we explore relate to each other's geographical spaces, political spaces, and so on. So let's think a little bit about the research project overview. And I think a good place to start is just to understand the kind of broader space that we're in terms of thinking about activism and social movements. And I think it's just important that you understand where I'm coming from when I'm talking about activism. And so there are many definitions of activism, but the one I tend to use is what I'll say now. And this is kind of set out within 3 areas. So firstly, there's a reference to the process of claim making. So within activism, what tends to happen at first is this notion of making a claim to assert a position that then starts to highlight particular issues. So in terms of disability, it may be highlighting a claim in relation to injustice. So it may be the discrimination that disabled people are experiencing, say in terms of accessing education or being part of a community, or highlighting claims around not wanting to be placed in segregated environments. And then what tends to happen once claims are being made, then we start to think about the coordinated activities that surround those claims. And this is often called collective action. So this is then about thinking how to bring together different groups and individuals who can have a shared interest in the claims that are being made. So we may have groups of individuals who are saying, I'm experiencing injustice, I'm being forced into segregated environments. And then as we start to recognize that more and more people are having these experiences and are starting to question these experiences, we then start to build up this collective action. So the first part is making the claim. Then the second part is thinking about that collective strategy and the collective voice of groups coming together because of a shared interest or claim. And then finally, within activism, the third part is this process of thinking about, well, we've got a claim and we've got groups of people who are having a shared interest in this. Where do we go next? Where and what do we do? And part of that is trying to then identify individuals or groups or bodies that have influence or authority or assume to have power that we want to then identify and try to challenge and resist and engage with in order to create change. So this is the process of trying to then think about, well, where do I focus my attention? I have a claim and I want to do something about it, but where am I focusing that attention on? That can be political figures. It could be people who run particular spaces, people who have particular resources that we want to try to access and perhaps change or influence. Or it may be other community groups that we want to influence because we want them to know about the claims we're making around injustice. So those three steps are associated with activism. And then as you start to broaden that out and make it bigger and larger, then you get the experience of social movements. And this is where we start to repeat those making of claims. We start to think about how to make more people aware of what we're doing, and then think about what kind of resources or things that we need as activists in order to mobilize and create change, and most importantly, sustain those claim-making processes. And sustainability is really key to activism, and particularly with disabled activists as well, because for young disabled activists, there are many pressures on their lives. There are issues of impairment and health conditions that need to be managed. So making sure that you're in a space which is accessible and safe and sustainable so that you can continue engaging in activism is really key here. So these are the things that I'll touch on as we work through my findings. And hopefully this will, you can start to draw links between this general understanding of activism, social movements, and what I found in my research. So if we've got a bit of a definition and understanding of activism, and now we're going to drill a little bit down into disability activism. And there are many ways of thinking through how to understand the purpose and significance of disability activism. I think it's important to say that there is no one shared agreement of this is what disability activism is, or this is what it is trying to do. There are many reasons why people get involved. There are many purposes, and there are many claims about what the world should look like and how it should function in order to accommodate and value disabled people's participation. So we want to start from a process of saying it's very messy and it's complicated and it's going in all different directions. And I think that's something that we should embrace, because we want to allow activists to say, these are the things that matter to me. This is what I want to focus on. And really, it's about how do we support each other as activists and as people interested in this topic to explore the things that matter to ourselves and each other. But within disability activism, what you tend to find across the globe is there is some tension points. One is around the issue of rights and legislation. Again, I'm going to come to this in the research because this is quite a prominent issue. But there's a focus for many activists on thinking about making change through legislation and relying on rights and laws and policies in order to create change. But for many other groups, there's a concern about relying heavily on rights and legislation. That may be because it doesn't go far enough in trying to challenge and address the things that are problematic for disabled people and their families, but also recognizing that there are many spaces across the globe where there is fluctuating systems of welfare and social security and politics. So there is no need, it's not possible to rely heavily on state infrastructure because it's not working or operating on a sustainable level. There's also within activism this focus on cultural and political activities. So thinking about orientating claims and focus on things that are associated with what it means to be a disabled person, and thinking about actually how do we maybe create notions of pride and acceptance and value over how our bodies work and how our minds process information, and recognizing that we want to challenge these ideas that there's only a one way of being that is valued, or there are certain things you have to do in a certain way in order to be a valuable human being. So again, we can think about disability activism within political spaces, within legislative spaces, within culture and economics, and so on. But what we tend to find throughout all the research and all the literature is that there has been a lack of recognition about young disabled people's engagement in activism and social movements. So there is a gap when it comes to thinking about the experiences of young disabled people in activism, and that can be disability activism, but it can also be activism in other forms of social justice. So when we think about youth participation, so to say young disabled people and youth participation, there is some research and findings that highlight that making sure that young disabled people have opportunities to inform and be part of activist networks and social movements is important, because it helps to inspire and it helps to ensure that young disabled people can influence leadership and help sustain social movements, and think about what different ways the strategies and demands around activism can work to accommodate and value the contributions and voices of young people. It's also important to have young activists involved in social movements and activism, because it challenges, and I think it's an unfair characterization, but it challenges this very dominant view in society that often is attributed to young people, which is that they are disengaged or they don't care about the things that are going on in the world. Of course, much of the literature challenges that, but there is a level of assumption made about young people's perspective and young people's desire to take part in social issues. And finally, there's also we know it's important for young people to take part in social movements and activism, because it helps to demonstrate and promote the importance of democratic forms of participation. So thinking about how do we ensure people from all different backgrounds, from all different experiences, recognize that they have value and worth in saying, this is my view, and saying, this is what is important to me. And so on the one hand, we have the opportunities, but we also have, there's concerns about the implications of where there is a lack of young people's participation in activism and social movements. There has been some worrying concerns about the impact that this has. One is that there is a real struggle for young activists and young people in activism to challenge these dominant conceptualizations that surround childhood and youth. So sometimes the notion or the idea of being a child or young person is then trapped in this idea that they're not quite an adult, they're nearly an adult, and therefore, because they are trapped in this perspective of being a child or a young person, their views have to be credited by, they have to have their views legitimized by older established individuals, or when they're making views and making their views known, they have to be validated by adults and others in their surroundings. So they can't make claims that are recognized as being worthwhile and valuable in their own right. It has to be justified and processed by older people who are then saying, well, this is an important point to make, we'll accept it, or this is a bit naive, don't talk about these kind of issues, and so on. So there's something here about recognizing that often the way in which we think about children and young people denies children and young people the opportunity to say, this is what's important to me, or these are my ideas, and these are my ideas that could help shape the demands and the strategies that surround activism and social movements. So the literature is showing us that there are concerns about the opportunities for young disabled people to take part in activism. And we know that when young disabled people are taking part in activism, they are also struggling to have their voices and views heard. And this is where I started then to think about my research. And my PhD, which I did in 2015 to 2019, was looking at young disabled people's experiences of disability activism in the UK. And when that finished, and I kind of came up with the findings around that, I wanted to kind of expand that to a European context. And this is what the project I've been working on for 4 years has been doing. And this is the reason why Dan asked me to come and speak to you all. So this project was looking at how young disabled activists engage in disability activism across Europe, and their experiences and their views about how activism works, and the frustrations that surround activism. And what I did was I wanted to ensure that we had a broad range of experiences. So the age range of activists were between the ages of 18 and 35. This is particularly because in European policy, youth and young people is often defined up until the age of 35. And it was important to recognize that self-determination and self-identification was also key here as well. So it wasn't saying that you had to have certain impairments or you had to have certain diagnoses or labels to be viewed as a disabled person. It was recognizing the importance of people who say, well, I identify as a disabled person, or as I experience disability, then that was enough to say, well, your voice matters and your voice is important. So there were 4 parts to the project with this project. So firstly, we conducted a survey. I say we, it was only me. I conducted a survey, and the survey was capturing the views and experiences of young disabled people, those who have experience of activism, disability activism, and those who don't have experience of it but are interested in it. So I captured their views of how they engage with activism and the frustrations and the opportunities that they have to do so. I then wanted to go a little bit deeper, so I then went into interviews where I interviewed a selection of participants and tried to delve a little bit deeper into their experiences of participating in activism in their communities, in their countries, or even across Europe as well, to gain more insight into those key issues that were emerging. I then also created what I call a future laboratory workshop. Oops, sorry, I've just gone too far. I then created what we call a future laboratory workshop. And this was an opportunity to bring together young disabled activists. We did this in 2 spaces. So the first space was a offline space in Brussels. Every 2 years in Brussels, there is what's called the Freedom Drive, which is an opportunity for activists and their organizations from across Europe to all come together in one space in Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium. And there they have, it's about a week-long event where there is discussions with each other about strategies and claims for the coming years of campaigning and activism. It's an opportunity to talk to policymakers in the European Commission that set policy across European countries. And it's also an opportunity to engage in workshops and discussions that are important to activists and disabled people's organizations. So I had a little bit of a space, occupied a space within this, the Freedom Drive. And I created what's called a future laboratory with a colleague of mine, Dr. Jade French. And what we did was we invited young disabled people to come together, and we wanted to offer the opportunity for each activist to produce in whatever that way they wanted to produce a page that captured their ideas and key issues around imagining accessible and inclusive societies. And the idea was then to create what we call a zine. So it's like a magazine, but a zine is created by a community for that particular community. And in the zine, each page is dedicated to one activist, and they presented their views and views about what does an accessible and inclusive society look like, or what's important when we think about accessibility and inclusion. I did this in Brussels, but I also did it online as well, where we had a remote workshop that was online and people could drop in and drop out whenever they wanted to. And they could use the opportunity to produce their page, and that they could then send that digitally to us, and we would include that in the in the zine. So the zine will be produced later in the year, but I have got some images that I want to show you later on in the presentation to highlight what imaginings were occurring within young disabled people's ideas about accessibility and inclusion. And the fourth area is around a documentary film. So this will be coming out next year. And it's a documentary film that charts the experiences and perspectives of young disabled activists. So really the documentary film is about what does disability activism mean across Europe? What are the experiences currently of young disabled people engaging in activism? And what are the things that we need to be aware of and think about in the future? So that's a lot of information. So in order to try to help summarize what the research was trying to find, essentially it was looking at 5 areas to do with activism across Europe. So firstly, there was this area around the reasons. So I wanted to try to capture what are the reasons why people engage in activism and in disability activism. Why do young disabled people want to be activists, really? And how do they do that? And then the next part was around the barriers. So what stops young disabled activists from taking part in their activism? What issues or factors are denying or restricting their participation in activism? The third area was around opportunities. So where are the opportunities to participate? Or what opportunities do young disabled activists want in order to take part in disability activism across Europe? The fourth area was around what I call resistance practices. And essentially what that means is, what are the different activities that young disabled activists do as part of their activism that they find to be enjoyable or most effective in trying to create claims and trying to create change? So I was interested in what types of practices are emerging. And finally, there was this focus on the future of disability activism. So asking young disabled activists to think about, well, what are the key issues that are going to be affecting young activists in the future, do they feel? Or what things do we need to be aware of now and start thinking about now that may be occurring in the future from their perspective? So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into the reasons why we did the project, or why I did the projects, and the kind of structure of the project. Now what I'll do is I'll take you through some of the kind of key headlines and findings that I think are most interesting for today, and I'll do it across those 5 areas. So I'll chart the findings across each of these different areas, and I've tried to consolidate much of the findings from the survey and from the interviews and from the workshops, the themes that came out of the workshops and films. I've tried to bring them together and present them in helpful graphs that will be a bit more visual for those who want it, in terms of being able to understand the findings a bit more. But I will talk through each finding as well. So let's start with reasons for participating in disability activism. And when I asked activists about young disabled activists about the reasons they take part in activism, it fell into these 5 areas, really. Firstly, there was a focus or a recognition around laws and the importance of rights in protecting disabled people. So 9 out of 10 activists wanted to engage their activism and focus it on the importance of rights and legislation. Then there was still quite prominent, there was a focus on, the second most popular reason was focusing on the political and economic conditions that marginalize disabled people. So again, 8 out of 10 activists wanted to think about focusing their activism, and the reasons for their activism was about trying to influence and impact the existing political and economic conditions. So they wanted to think about, in the interviews, they talked about trying to produce better opportunities to gain employment, or to challenge the conditions around employment so that there wasn't so much of an emphasis on having to work in a particular way, and trying to challenge ideas of productivity linked to labor market participation. They wanted to question the roles in which government and political structures were working and how they may be creating more problems for disabled people. So there was this focus on the economics and the political decisions that surround disabled people's lives. And then there seemed to be a kind of clustering around the next three areas. And again, this is around 7 in 10 people were talking about these issues. So firstly, there was a focus on trying to work with and influence people who can improve disabled people's lives. So this was about activists talking about saying, well, through my activism, I'm trying to find out who has influence and authority in daily life that can impact the disabled people's community. That could be, and people talked about medical professionals, they talked about decision makers in the local area, they talked about schools and teachers, they talked about community figures who hold a lot of influence in the local community. And they wanted to focus their attention on trying to inform those people and those groups about the importance of disability activism and the importance of ideas of how to try to create social change around disabled people's lives, and thinking about what does creating accessible and inclusive communities look like, and then making sure that those who have influence and authority in the community are aware of what those demands are and what those imaginings are. There was also, I think, this emphasis on coming together and building alliances. So again, 7 in 10 young activists wanted to spend a lot of time thinking about how to build sustainable activities between different groups of activists and bringing people together. And again, this goes back to the point at the beginning when we talked about the importance of creating a shared identity. And the importance here is, how do activists want to bring different groups together in order to build sustainable demands, but also making sure that you're bringing people together to help advance and progress the work that you're trying to do as an activist. And finally, there was this focus on pride as well, and the importance of young activists saying that part of their activism is about challenging the cultural stigma and shame that is associated with the identity of disability, and to think about disability pride and the importance of celebrating identity. And many activists here in the European context talked about the importance of challenging those ideas that there is a certain type of way of existing. Some people call this around ideas of ableism, if people are familiar with the term ableism. But this idea that there are certain traits and values and attributes that you need to have in order to be considered a useful or productive or important individual. And often disabled people are denied those spaces. But what was happening here was activists were saying, well, we want to disrupt those ideas. Our activism is trying to disrupt the idea that there's a certain way of being or existing in society. And actually, when you've got communities with all different needs and health conditions and impairments and ways of being and functioning and processing information, what we're trying to do with our activism is to try to recognize that there is variance in human existence. We are all part of a variation in this notion of human existence, and we want to celebrate all variations of that and recognize that everybody may be different and may be experiencing things in different ways, but everybody still has value. Everybody is still important and needs and requires participation in the spaces that they want to participate in. I also asked activists to talk a little bit about where did they focus their attention, because often, and the literature again highlights this, that there isn't a kind of understanding of why do activists focus in certain spaces. So, for example, there are some activists who will engage on the national level, so they want to try to change things within a country context. There may be some who want to focus internationally, so thinking about how to use their activism and produce their claims and demands about trying to create change across a clustering of countries or a region of the globe, or even globally across all countries as well. And again, there are, as you start to bring that down, there are activists who want to focus much more at the local level in their communities and only want to pursue opportunities in the local level or in a particular region of the country. And some activists, again, think about their activism not within a geographical space, but think about it more in terms of their empowerment and their own personal understanding and consciousness around these different issues. So when we asked activists to kind of chart where they position themselves in terms of participating in activism, there was a heavy focus, more so on others. There was a heavy focus on the national context. So many activists were not thinking about trying to create change primarily in their local area or on an international level. They were looking at it and trying to create change across the nation in which they were living in. And I think that's quite interesting as well, because as we started to do the interviews, some activists were saying it's really hard to try to engage at a local level. There isn't resources for that. Many organizations only operate under national focus, or they're trying to influence national agendas. And this means it's really difficult to try to find activists at a local level. And there were other activists who were talking about wanting to focus much more on a local level, because they could then understand change much more clearly. They could point to change and social change much more clearly than waiting for longer processes of change across a national context. So again, I think this raises some really interesting questions about where do we as activists situate ourselves, where do we want to focus our attention, and why, and how do we kind of grapple with those different spaces, sometimes focusing on a local issue or a national issue or an international issue. So in the interviews, what I tended to also kind of highlight in terms of themes, and this came out of the surveys and the interviews and the discussions with in the workshops and film, documentary film, is that there seems to be a clustering of activists who want to focus more on the radical edge of social change. So they're much more interested in trying to overhaul the existing ways that things are done. They're trying to create real disruption within the systems and processes that currently exist, and they want to reimagine those processes, whether that may be reimagining, completely reimagining how we do education, how we think about work and employment, how we think about supporting people to live the life that they want to live, how we think about people having access to, say, suitable housing, and so on. And there were other activists who were clustering around this idea of incremental change. So they wanted to rely on existing infrastructures, such as existing laws, existing policies, existing processes of trying to create change, and wanted to try to use their activism to make the change much more incrementally, and trying to say, well, we'll try to make tweaks to the existing system rather than argue for a radical overhaul. And again, as I said, there's this focus on political and economic issues, as well as rights and legislation. And there's this really fascinating idea of the kind of identity and how activism is linked to the importance of talking about disability as an identity. And for many activists, young activists, in the project, they spoke about the need for thinking about disability as a political issue. So for many years, they've been told that disability is an internal problem. It's to do with them. A lot of it is to do with shame and stigma. A lot of it is to do with their own responsibility to navigate the problems that they're experiencing on a daily basis. And through the process of activism, they were starting to recognize that actually it's not their fault that they're experiencing injustice or their families are experiencing injustice. It's due to the way society is organized. It's due to the processes that surround how the decisions are made in their life, the opportunities and resources, or the lack of opportunities and resources. So they recognize that their identity is a political one, and therefore it requires political recognition in trying to make claims for social change and justice. And then, of course, there's this focus on on building alliances as well. I'm wondering if we could maybe just take a bit of a pause at this point, Dan, if we could maybe just invite any comments around. I'd be fascinated to know why people from their own experiences or their own communities, what are the reasons for participating in activism and advocacy where we're all based across the region and across the globe.
So please either just put a hand up and I'll come over to you, or please feel free to use the chat, whichever one works best for you. All right, I'm going to go over to Constance, first of all, followed by Ronald. Over to you, Constance.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the topic. I really like it because here in Nigeria, I am an advocate for persons with disabilities, especially women and girls with disabilities. So the reason why I participate in activism is for policy review, policy reform, policy change, because in Nigeria, disability is still very new. So they do not really understand the issues, and a lot of policies we have never really factored persons with disabilities, like some health policies, gender policies, the VAP Act, and a lot of laws that we have do not factor in persons with disabilities. So the reason why I participate in activism for persons with disabilities is to ensure that policies are reviewed, policies there's policy reform, and also to create awareness to rights, because we know that human rights is you have rights just being a human being, but most persons with disabilities do not understand. So we also create awareness as we talk to policymakers. We also create awareness to persons with disabilities themselves to understand the rights-based approach to getting to having access to enjoying their human rights to the full extent they're supposed to.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. I think there's so much of what you said which is so important. On at one point you spoke about the importance of recognizing issues affecting women and girls, and that's a real key issue, I think, that needs to be highlighted more in activism, particularly in disability activism, is the importance. Some of us call it intersectionality, the importance of how different characteristics and experiences are intersecting, and how that is then valued and recognized within the claims that are being made, so that when we're talking about what needs to change in society, it is tapping into and it is focusing on the unique experiences that come out of people's different experiences coming together, such as gender and disability, or ethnicity and disability. So that was a really helpful point. Thank you so much. And also that key point about trying to inform policy and recognize and utilize existing human rights, not just to gain recognition that SAIL people are human beings who need protection, but then also to utilize human rights in order to reimagine possibilities of what can change and how it could change. So thank you, Constance. I'm going to move on, and then we'll pause again for another comment, and then we'll have a bit more of an open discussion at the end, if that's okay. So
thanks, Ronald and Paul. We'll come back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, anybody who's indicating, please keep your thoughts, because we'll come back to all of these questions at the end as well.
Hello. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
So in terms of, I want to move towards barriers now. So we talked a little bit about reasons. Now I want us to talk a little bit about the barriers that deny or stop young disabled people in Europe from taking part in activism. So in talking and in capturing people's views through the survey and through interviews, what I tended to find was there was a range of different barriers, as we can imagine, but some stood out more than others. So right at the top, the main issue barrier-wise was the issue of time. So not having sufficient time to take part in activism. And I think that this raises some really interesting questions within the context of young disabled people, because on one hand, in society, we can think about how time is used in a way to control people's lives, that we struggle to have time to do many different things in our lives. But when we think about disabled people's lives and we think about the levels of injustice that disabled people experience, often when you're encountering restrictions and barriers, you are then occupying a lot of your time trying to navigate around these particular barriers. Then there's also the issue of the additional things that you have to do as a disabled person in order to manage your needs, or in order to access different spaces to have your needs met. That can take a considerable amount of time as well. So I think there's something really fascinating about the premise of time, and how we can then think about, well, in what ways can we create more time for people to spend thinking about or participating in activism and political change. There was also the issue of financial constraints as well. So there was a lack of funding opportunities for people to have access to finances in order to take part in activism. And again, that could be that was in interviews and so on, that was raised as people not having enough money to take part in terms of traveling to different spaces to engage in activism, or to buy things associated with their activism and things that they wanted to make or create as part of their activism, but also the financial implications of their support as well. So many activists spoke about, well, in fact, all activists spoke about that where they receive funding for support, so that may be equipment, or it may be personal assistance or support workers, never has there been a budget allocated towards supporting them to take part in activism and citizenship and kind of community politics or community activism. So there is a recognition that often disabled people have to absorb the cost of their support in order then to take part. And I think this raises some really fascinating questions about how do we reimagine support, or how do we ensure that we are allocating support in a way where disabled people can then access sufficient support to take for the purpose of taking part in activism as well. There was, again, one of the key issues was around the insufficiency of opportunities to take part. So young activists talked about there's a lack of opportunities to take part in activism, that there wasn't spaces made available to engage in activism. And then as you go through the list, there are other issues as well, in terms of lack of technologies that were available, people being unfamiliar with campaigns, people being unfamiliar with what does disability activism mean, and because they're unfamiliar with it, there's a reluctance to take part in it because they haven't had that support to understand the ideas that surround activism, the different ways in which people can take part in campaigns as well. There was also issues of discouragement as well. So many activists talked about how people in their lives, such as their family or friends or professionals that they have to engage in, medical professionals, social workers, and so on, would discourage them from taking part in activism. Or indeed, other activists themselves would say to young disabled people that you shouldn't be an activist, or you're not doing activism in a good way, or a proper way, or in a welcome way. So actually, you should stop doing it. So there was also experiences of activists, young activists, being discouraged from taking part in activism. When I asked activists to talk about their knowledge of disability activism, there was the general answer was that young activists had a slight understanding of disability activism within their own country, but again, it was kind of spread across different areas as well. So some felt that they were very knowledgeable about it in their own country. Some people thought they were fairly knowledgeable, but most people, and even in the interviews as well, spoke about that they only had slight understanding of it, that there was a lack of awareness and opportunities to learn more about disability activism in their own country. And when I asked people about their awareness of activism opportunities to learn more about disability activism and to understand disability activism across Europe, the majority of people said that they were not aware of opportunities. Again, I think that raises some really interesting questions as networks and as research groups and as activist networks. What can we be doing within our own countries or in regions of the globe to produce opportunities for people to learn more about what is disability activism in a way which is about ensuring activists can learn more in order to feel more comfortable and confident and possible and valued as an activist as well. One area that I'm quite interested in with this research was about the expectation of knowledge. So many activists spoke to me in the project about struggling to engage with activists and with established groups because there was an expectation that they had to know a certain amount about activism in order to take part. And they were expected to know a certain amount. And what this research showed us that when we look at it across Europe, there are different levels of expectation. So in some ways, in some spaces, young activists said, well, nobody expects me to know anything about it. I can come in and I can be welcomed in those spaces. But then it starts to chart and you get slight expectations. You get people thinking that you have to know quite a lot about activism in order to take part and have opportunities. And some activists were saying, well, other activists around me consider it essential that you have to know a certain level of information and knowledge about disability activism in order to take part. So again, I think there's something really fascinating here about, on the one hand, opening up opportunities to learn more about the knowledge around activism, so knowing what it means, what the possibilities are, what ways it has been done in the past, what opportunities are there to think about the purpose of disability activism in today and drawing on things that we've been speaking about and like Constance talked about in terms of policies and laws and the intersections between different characteristics and so on. So there's, on one hand, there's recognizing that there needs to be space to learn and there is a desire to learn about these things, but also how there's also a danger that we are creating a level of expectation that some activist networks are saying, well, if you want to take part, you need to know a certain amount before you're seen as a legitimate or a credible voice in activism. So there are some really fascinating questions here about knowledge and the expectation of knowledge as well. So if I could invite maybe one comment again, if we just pause for one, I'd be really fascinated to know from somebody, what barriers do you experience when you're participating in activism? Again, Dan, if I can hand over to you.
Yeah, and any hands up? Oh, there we go, Brenda. You're the first up. Let me hand over to Brenda.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to put a comment about the barriers. For example, in the Uganda context, most of the activists or advocates have turned disability activism into political activism. And most of the activists are now coming in the political angle. And secondly, the activism activities have been monetized. The moment you start the activism, people start expecting the money. They expect that people still think maybe you got a funding from somewhere, and you're trying to, to do the accountability to that funding. So those are the major challenges that are really faced. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Thank you so much, Brenda. So again, there's this issue around the finance and the reliance on finance, but also the expectation as well. And this came up in the research in Europe as well, that many activists spoke about. They were forced to engage in conversations where demands and the priorities for the claims and the activism were centered around which would get most funding. So rather than think about the issues that were most important to the young activists themselves, often the campaigns were only centered on campaigning issues that were going to receive funding in order then to fulfill the campaign journey and the issues that come out of that. So again, there's something here about how finance, there's a reliance on finance, but also how activism is being skewed towards focusing on which is going to be receiving most money, or for some activists, where do I want to focus my attention on, because that's going to allow me access to certain pots of money as well. So thank you for that. So we spoke a little bit about reasons, and we spoke a little bit about barriers. And now I just want us to think a little bit about opportunities as well. So in terms of where I asked for, activists where would they go for advice and information about opportunities to take part in disability activism. And the majority of people spoke about social media, so utilizing social media networks in order to take part in activism, or to learn more about activism. But there was also after social media networks, there was a clustering around disabled people's organizations, first at the national level, then local and regional, and then the international as well. So it seems to be that the majority of people wanted to talk about opportunities in relation to social media, and then to existing campaign groups and organizations made up of disabled people. Then it starts to break down into different clustered areas. People talked about engaging with friends. A third of participants spoke about engaging with organizations that are focused on supporting disabled people, but they're not run by disabled people. Again, I think that raises some really interesting questions about recognizing that we want to build alliances and relationships between disabled people's organizations and more traditional organizations that maybe are not controlled by, but still access resources and ways of influencing. So again, you can see with this slide, and this, I'll send the slides around as well for people to, if people want to look at them in their own time, that there is, when it comes to getting advice, it's clustering around different spaces, but particularly in terms of social media and existing disabled people's organizations. And when I asked people to think about ways to improve participation, many spoke about the kind of top three were firstly about creating safe and accessible spaces. So there was a recognition that in existing activist networks, there tends to not be spaces that are accessible or that are supportive for young disabled people to talk about their ideas, in terms of ideas for social change, their ideas for existing demands, their ideas for what the priorities should be or what matters to them as young disabled people. There was a lack of space given to nurturing and facilitating the voices of young disabled activists. There was also an issue around accessing materials that were free and in accessible formats that highlighted key debates and issues within disability activism. So many young activists wanted the access to materials so they could learn more about the existing key debates and existing issues within disability activism, but they didn't have knowledge of where to go to find that. And then finally, there was a recognition that in the top three, there was a recognition of broader diversity and representation within activism. And this was about young activists who spoke to me in the interviews and in the workshops and through their survey response as well, talking about that often there are certain types or characteristics of disabled people who occupy very dominant spaces. And for example, in European context, often this was white, male, heterosexual disabled people, usually with physical impairments, that were then denying or dismissing the voices of disabled people who were coming from various different communities. So, for example, thinking about the nuance and the intersections between gender and disabled people's experiences. Many activists talked about how people who were coming from the transgender community were often ignored or dismissed and denied opportunities to inform and influence disability activism in their communities. And again, we can think about this in different intersections through ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and so on. So there was a question here about how to ensure that activism is welcoming all contributions from people from all different experiences and backgrounds, but also that the priorities and the demands and the claims that are being made within disability activism are reflective of the experiences of people from all different communities as well, and not just becoming truncated or squashed into a very specific experience of disability, often by those who have dominated the space for many years. When I asked activists to talk about whether they thought European disabled people's social movements were doing enough to support newcomers to engage in activism, and newcomers could be anybody who is new to disability activism, but in particular young disabled people, the majority said either no or I don't know. So very little of people said yes. I think the figure was around 7%. So only 7% of activists involved in the study said that European disabled people's movements were doing enough to support newcomers. The majority said that not enough is being done. And that raises, again, questions about what we can do to try to challenge that. Just because of time, I'm not going to pause for a reflection, but I'm going to give you a question just to think about, really. And again, we can pick this up later, perhaps. But one thing that was quite interesting was this tension around whose responsibility is it to support young disabled people to take part in activism. And what was quite interesting was that some people spoke about it's the young disabled person's responsibility to achieve active participation. So it's the responsibility of the young person to say, I'm going to persevere and push through and try to take part and demonstrate that I am here and I want my voice recognized and heard, and my voice needs to inform and influence existing activist arrangements and demands and strategies. And other activists spoke about it's the responsibility of the existing networks of activists to support and encourage young disabled people to come forward. So again, there's this kind of tension emerging between activists who think it's the responsibilities on the young people themselves to find ways to take part, and others who are saying, well, it's the responsibility of existing networks to change and adapt and accommodate the voices. And what was surprising for me was there were many young people themselves who said, actually, I feel like it is my responsibility to take part, rather than be encouraged and supported and welcomed by existing activists. Many young disabled people said it's my responsibility to try and find a way to gain prominence and visibility within activism, even if I keep getting pushed back. And I think that raises some really fascinating questions about perhaps that, are we placing this kind of internal feeling of responsibility on young people to think that they are also the problem and trying to find ways to take part, rather than making sure that our activist networks are welcoming and being visibly welcome and encouraging people from all different communities to come forward to take part in activism. So in terms of resistance practices, when we talk to people about different experiences of resistance, what we and the different activities that people do, there was kind of clustering around several different areas. So one was the importance of publishing essays and articles. So people wanted opportunities to write about their experiences and wanted to document and kind of have a space to put their ideas about the world and about social change and about what the priorities need to be in order to create accessible and inclusive societies. Others spoke about the importance of information, and some people spoke about the importance of working with government officials and departments. There was a strong emphasis on social media, so people wanting to share information across social media platforms and utilize social media as a way to gain visibility within their activism as well. And many people wanted to take part in public debate, so they spoke to me about saying that sometimes they were quite frustrated with only talking about disability to either other disabled people's communities or talking to policymakers who are already involved in disability or legislators who are already involved in disability. What they wanted to do with their activism is to go and talk to public spaces who had very little interest in disability or were assumed to think that disability wasn't an important issue to think about. They wanted to try to inform those spaces where people had very little understanding or awareness or consideration for disabled people's lives. Less so, there was a focus on protesting and the visibility of what we call civil disobedience. So the resistance practices associated with disobedience in terms of protesting, in terms of attending large gatherings, or trying to engage in what's sometimes referred to as direct action, where you're trying to create disruption in a space. This came lower down the list, but it was still prominent. Almost 50% or just over 50% of activists wanted to engage in civil disobedience. But there was a more emphasis on sharing information, disseminating information, and having the opportunity to have their ideas recorded about what constitutes producing social change and making a better world. There were several questions that we asked about social media, and I've taken one here just as out of interest, but we gave them several statements to read and asked them to rank where they thought themselves in terms of agree or disagree. And one question was, we asked them was, social media, do you agree or disagree that social media makes people think they are making a difference when they really are not? And there was kind of divergence of perspective. Some people thought that on the whole that social media does make a difference, but other people had talked about that perhaps people assume that their engagement in social media is making a difference when really it isn't. So again, it highlights some of the messiness that surrounds the different campaign tactics and practices that people use, and the frustrations that occur when people are trying to create change or trying to have visibility about the things that they want to change, whether that is through social media or through direct action or through trying to engage in local community spaces. And there was also this recognition. I asked people about levels of engagement, and on the whole, activists thought about their activism on a daily basis, and they felt that they were doing activism on a daily basis. But again, there was a clustering. So on the whole, people felt that they were being more active either daily or weekly, and occasionally, there was a smaller number of people who felt that they could only occupy doing activism on a monthly basis or periodically throughout the year. And I think what's quite interesting about this is that many activists spoke about when they identified as an activist, they felt that there was a kind of political awakening and consciousness, that they realized that there was so much injustice around their lives that they could never see it differently. And that they, even in the brief daily things that they were doing in their lives, they could understand it within the context of disabled people's injustice. So recognizing that injustice, calling it out, trying to create change, it becomes a daily experience once one identifies as an activist. Again, I'm just going to give you this question to think about, because I do want to leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So perhaps if people want to come back to it in the Q&A, I'd be fascinated to know what kind of activities you feel are most effective in the things that you do around activism or your networks. So I just want to focus on the last area before I leave a bit of time for questions. I know Dan has to go at past, but I'm happy to stay on if it's helpful to people, if people want to stay and have a bit more of a longer chat. But in terms of the future of disability activism, again, we did this in several ways. One area was to ask a series of questions, and I was quite interested in showing you this because in many of the interviews and in the workshops with young activists, we spoke about do young activists feel that they need to have a clear understanding of the solution to the campaign issue that they're trying to engage in. So when an activist is trying to engage in a campaign, do they have to already have come up with the solution and as part of their campaigning and trying to call out levels of injustice or highlight problems and issues. And there was a general disagreement that there was a general view that of disagreement. So this meant that many activists said you don't need to come up with a solution to the thing that you're campaigning about. You can use your activism to highlight it as a problem rather than have to have a complete package of this is the problem, this is what we need to do about it. But again, there was some people, it was kind of spread, in terms of some people felt undecided about whether you needed to or not, and some people agree that you have to come up with a solution as well. So this for me raises some really interesting questions about campaign strategy and the emphasis that is placed on identifying the problems that affect disabled people in everyday life, and the spaces that we give to thinking about, well, what are the solutions to the problems that we are engaging with and that we are experiencing on a daily basis. And the other question, again, there was several statements, but one of the ones I want to show you was, I asked activists to think about, do activists need to have a lot of knowledge and insight on a particular issue before they start campaigning? And again, it was quite spread. So for some activists, they felt that you did need to know a lot about the particular topic that you're campaigning on. Others disagreed, and they said in their interviews that, we need to recognize the importance of the personal experience, and that people's own experiences of particular topics and issues, that needs to be recognized and celebrated. Whereas other activists, young activists, said, well, you can talk about your personal experience, but if you become too focused on the personal experience, it loses that kind of recognition that this is affecting lots of different people in lots of different spaces across a particular context. So there was a real kind of concern about the use of knowledge and insight and personal experience on the campaigns and topics that young activists were talking about. So as I come to a close, I wanted just to just show you some of the imagery, and I'll describe it from the workshops where we asked people to create a page for a zine, and the zine will be coming out later in the year, and it will be on my research website, and it will be digital and free, and you can have copies, and you can download them and disseminate them in any spaces that you want to. But with the zine, again, we brought people together and asked them to, utilizing imagery around them from magazines or online printing and so on, to create a reflection of what is most important to them when we think about the future of society. In the first image here, I have images of clocks and watches, and there is coffee mugs with boss and management written on them. And what this activist spoke to me about was the frustration that is placed on disabled people due to the concept of time. So again, this came up before, didn't it, in terms of barriers to participation, but the ways in which disabled people's lives are so controlled by time and authority that, for this activist, in order to imagine accessibility and inclusive societies, we have to disrupt how time is understood and how time is used in a way to control or devalue disabled people's lives. So for example, when disabled people are trying to access services, the way in which sometimes in Europe, you have to wait a certain amount of time in order to access a service, or you have to respond in a certain amount of time, or you have to do things in a particular way in a certain period of time in order to be told whether you can proceed to the next, in terms of education, you have to do testing in a certain way in a certain constrained time. So the issue of time for this activist was really important and wanted to be disrupted in thinking about accessible and inclusive societies. In the second imagery, there is this focus on buildings and inaccessible steps and the lack of safe ramps for a wheelchair user to use in order to move through the environment. So for this activist, their focus was on the changing of built environments, the moving away from dangerous architectural spaces to accessible spaces, thinking about the importance of inclusion, thinking about the importance of the visibility of disabled people campaigning together in order to create change. The third imagery on the slide is I asked activists what they were doing, and they said, well, for me, I just wanted to write a very clear statement to people, and I'll read it to you. It says, if you always do what you've always done, you will always get what you have always got, and you need to be the change. So for me, this was really fascinating, because the activists spoke to me as they were writing this about the importance of telling people not to be complacent in thinking that what's happening, it just has to happen the way it is. You always have the possibility to resist. You have the possibility to create change. You don't have to accept the conditions that are in front of you. You can resist individually or collectively. I thought that was a really fascinating and powerful statement. And then the other two I wanted to show you briefly was, firstly, on the left-hand side, an activist who wanted to be named, and his name is Nicholas, and he wrote a statement for his page, and I want to read you the statement because I think it's really, really important, and kind of captures a lot of what we've been talking about today. So Nicholas wrote, I expect our society to treat every individual with respect and consideration, no matter what they look like, what their brain is like, what their job is like, what their ethnicity is like, what their gender is like, what their religious affiliation is like. I think it's depressing to have to apologize for who we are, as if we are the ones who had to constantly make an effort to become horribly standardized humans. I am a person with rights, and I have no reason to feel guilty for finding this world globally inadequate and inaccessible. I will fight until the day you no longer think of us as people to eliminate, pitied with a tear in your eye, or as superheroes to be glorified. And I think that is such a stark statement, and captures so much of the nuance around disability activism in the way it tries to challenge the cultural and the political and the economic contexts that surround disabled people's injustices. And finally, on the right-hand side, there was this imagery by an activist who drew a collection of different eyes, and then around those eyes wrote different statements. And I'll just read some of them to you. I won't read all of them, but they said, I'm allowed to rest. I love myself. I am worthy. Sexy is a vibe, not a body type. I hate my pain, but not myself. I can say no. And productivity is a lie. So again, clear statements that meant so much to that individual in terms of the importance and the power of what they wanted to highlight through their activism. And again, I'll leave you a question here, which we can pick up on in the chat, hopefully, is in the research and in the interviews, there was this tension came up again between those who want incremental change compared to those who want to have radical overhaul of the existing systems. And for some activists, they orientated towards this phrase, which was, I asked them to choose between the two. And firstly, some of them said, it is possible to build inclusive and accessible societies by working with the existing political and economic arrangements. So you start from what we currently have and try to realize inclusion and accessibility through what we currently have. And the other perspective from activists was to say, you have to completely radically change the way in which society is organized. You have to kind of go through that process of overhauling political and economic arrangements. So again, it's the radical versus the incremental, which I think is something that a dilemma that many of us as activists have to engage with, which is, do you pursue the demands that call for radical change and overhaul, or do you pursue the demands that are about incremental change within the existing systems that we have today? And I won't summarize what we talked about, because hopefully that you can pull out what's been of interest to you. But when you get the slides in your pack, this slide just helps kind of summarize what we've spoken about today. And finally, these are my contact details, and you are most welcome to contact me in whichever way is most accessible to you. If you want to have a chat about the research, or you want me to go over a particular part again, or if you disagree with anything I've spoken about at all, I'm open to hearing any comment or views. But I'll stop sharing now, and hopefully we'll have, well, we only have 5 minutes until the official end. But again, I'm happy to stay on if that's useful to people as well.
Yeah, let's do that and just play it by ear, Miro. So I'm going to hand over the hosting to Caitlin in a minute to take some more of the questions and comments, because I think it'd be good for us to hear from some of our participants here today. So yeah, let me first of all join in the thanks for that wonderful presentation, really informative, and so relevant to the work that many of us are doing here. We've got several questions that you raised, as well as perhaps some points that other colleagues here want to pick up too. I mean, I wonder whether I just hand it over and just take a few questions and see where we go from there, if that's all right. I noted down some of the questions that you asked in yours, not all of them, but I'll paste them into the chat and just to remind people of some of the questions that Miro was asking as discussion points. But I'm going to go first to, I think it was Ronald, because Ronald put his hand up at the very start and I wasn't able to get to him. So Ronald, can I pass over to you for a comment or a question? Your hand's gone down. Are you there, Ronald? In which case, I'm going to jump over to Yewande. Are you there?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, just some few comments and observations. As someone who fell into disability activism as a participant over like 12 years ago, and then someone who just got her first role a few months ago leading disabled people's activism project, I would say that a lot of the barriers that I find, and also the young people that I'm starting to work with find in participating in activism, are things such as people wanting to have young people to have prior knowledge of activism. I think that can be a huge barrier. I wasn't expected to have prior knowledge, and I felt really welcomed when I entered the movement. And also with my project that is currently running, I'm also finding that disabled young people are being welcomed into other movements, because I think sometimes the disability movement doesn't always acknowledge intersectionality and that disabled young people have other identities. So we're finding that a lot of disabled young people are in other movements like the Black Rights Movement and climate crisis movement. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say, and it was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. And whereabouts are you based, Amanda? Are you based in the UK?
I'm based in the UK, yes. I'm in Southeast London.
Fantastic. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Right, let's go over to Alex, please. Alex Pearl, if you're there.
Hi guys, I just wanted to say thank you both so much for arranging and for the excellent presentation, Myra. I was really fascinated to listen to the findings about how maybe movements aren't creating enough space and enough ways in for young people who want to engage in disability activism. And I think I only really understood myself as an activist after quite a number of years in higher education. I think I was an activist when I was a disabled child, but I didn't know I was. And I didn't feel I was in a space that inhibited that or had access to that space. So have you got any kind of insight, Myra, into young people's route into activism? Did the research look at that at all? And is there a way we can kind of use that to our advantage as academics and networks? And also I wondered whether people's motivations for being disability activists change and grow over time as they do. I think mine kind of went from an individual concept to a collective one over time. So I was wondering if you'd seen any of that in the research as well. But thank you again for such a great presentation.
Thanks, Alex. Dan, do you want me to respond now, or you wanting to take a couple of questions?
Yes, please, Mara. Dan has just left. So,
Okay.
or yes, please, if you can respond now.
Okay. So I think that's really great questions, Alex. I think so. In terms of the first question about reasons and routes into it, that certainly was picked up in the interviews in particular. And the last part of the project now is to write the book. So this will be one of the focal areas of the book that comes out next year. But often there was it kind of clustered around three areas really. Firstly, there was activists who spoke about their motivation was because of their experience at school. So the frustrations that they experienced when they were in school, trying to gain opportunity to participate in school or having their needs denied in school. The second area was around the focus of employment, and many activists spoke about when they were transitioning from education into either wanting to be in employment or having expectations placed upon them that they needed to be in employment. Because I'm, in a radical way, one of my arguments as personally as an activist is that I think we need to be cautious about this idea that employment is a gateway for disabled people's liberation. If disabled people want to pursue work, then okay, but we need to question what is work and what is productivity in terms of employment. But many activists spoke about how when they were struggling to access work or having to find work in order to live and exist and survive, this is where they started to identify many barriers and restrictions, and that then kind of bred their view of activism. And the final area was the disconnect with parents. So many activists spoke about how there was a very small number of activists who spoke about parents who were in that, following that kind of lens of disability activism, thinking about disability through lenses of liberation and emancipation and so on. The majority of parents were reproducing notions of protectionism and safety and kind of those lenses of vulnerability. So there was, as young activists, as people were kind of growing up and thinking about their identity, they were starting to then struggle with having self-determination, having choice and control, wanting to take risks in their lives, pursuing things that mattered to them as individuals, and the issues that was having with their parents. So that was also a motivation then for wanting then to start thinking about, well, where do I go? And as they started to engage in either peer support or local campaigning groups, they then got ideas of choice and control and self-determination and the philosophies of independent living and so on. So those were the kind of three main areas, and then the sustainability of that relied heavily on whether there was a local disabled people's organization that could facilitate their engagement. And for some activists, they would then start working in areas of campaigning and policy work. For others, they were just doing it as part of their other activities and strategies. And then across the life course, I don't really have the data for that with this project because it hasn't charted people over a particular life course. And there wasn't that much retrospective looking back in terms of childhood. But I think that would make for a great project to explore that further.
Okay, thank you very much, Myra. And we have Ronald here, who we lost earlier. Ronald?
Thank you very much. I'm Ronald from Uganda, and I just wanted to comment on the most effective most effective ways for activism I've seen in Uganda here. The direct action has mostly worked in engaging private players. I've seen activists who have refused to vacate some parking lots because maybe the organization, the company, or the building asset have not designated a place for disabled for space for the disabled drivers, and actions have been taken in that regard. And actually, sometimes when students also in different universities and schools stage a protest, actions have been taken, so it is most effective. But also, most young people fear taking part in activism because it is labeled dangerous. It is discouraged by government and other parents and the public. So most young people fear take part in activism because it is the people, they think when you take part in activism, you'll be denied chance to participate in other activities that could be helpful, impactful in education or in employment. Will be denied employment opportunities. So yeah, that's how activism is viewed in this world. Thank you. We actually, your presentation resonates with what happens here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronald. Mario, would you like to comment on this?
I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear precisely what Ronald was saying. I caught glimpses of it, but I think my understanding is that you were highlighting the kind of complexity around participating and thinking it through different ways in which the reasons why people do it. And I think that's an important point to, if I've understood you correctly, I think that's an issue that we need to think about within our strategies, which is how do we focus our attention, especially in the first instance, when we're thinking about the claims that we're trying to make, where do we focus our attention in the first instance? And then how do we kind of build up collaboration, particularly when activists are either coming from different perspectives or they are starting to think about the solutions in different ways. And this is where you kind of get complications between those who want to be more radical and those who want to be more incremental. And I think, there's an argument, and I have this coming out in the paper shortly, is, the radical activists and the incremental activists rely upon each other at all times. They're not in opposition to each other. They're actually in simultaneous collaboration, and they require each other in order to push forward with trying to create change. But I'm sorry if I've misunderstood your question, because the sound wasn't great on my computer, so I apologize for that.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Brenda, and I'm aware of time, and we have 5 more people who would like to comment. So if you can please keep it short, your questions. Thank you. Brenda?
So much. I loved this very beautiful question that you asked about. It was about having a solution before you do activism. We need to understand that there is a little bit difference between activism and advocacy, and advocacy is just speaking out about the issues and the social issues and the challenges that persons with disabilities face. But also for activism, we are looking at taking action, taking action about these issues that the social issues that are affecting persons with disabilities. So if we are really to look at a very effective and successful activism, then we need to look at the actions to take forward. For example, yes, having a solution is a very good strategy for one to have an effective and successful activism. And then also another point to note was about having the knowledge or information. What I can tell activists is that we really have to read, because if you are not informed, then you can easily be challenged and then you're caught off guard, So if we really take time to read these publications, these findings from such researchers and all that, it can really help us and get us informed and know how best we can really speak about these issues and also take actions about these issues. Otherwise, I thank you so much for this informative session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thanks a lot, Brenda. Myra, that's something that also came in the chat, the difference between activism and advocacy, and some people prefer one term or the other. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's some really, I haven't seen the chat material, but in terms of Brenda's points, I think that's really important, is thinking about how we understand these different terms and their different purposes and their strategic purposes for what change we want to create. But also, I think that raises an important point about where people, particularly, and for me, I'm most interested in young people, where most young people feel comfortable orientating towards. So, you know, I had many people who talked to me and said, well, I'm taking part in your research, but I would never call myself an activist. I would call myself an advocate, or I would call myself a campaigner. And then I had other people who said, oh, no, this is much about activism. But when they spoke, they were talking about issues and ways of doing things which was more associated with the typical understanding of advocacy. So I think that it raises some really important questions about where people feel comfortable and what they wanted to do. But I would also say as well, and I was thinking when you were talking, Brenda, about that the importance of advocacy highlighting issues. But I suppose as somebody who's interested in the concept of resistance, I think even in highlighting, you are affecting change in that way, even if you don't come up with a solution and a strategy for saying this is what we're going to do through our activist network. The importance of advocacy in raising something and making something become more visible and raising awareness is a form of disruption and a form of resistance in my view. And I think there's something here about how we ensure that we are giving people enough support in order to feel comfortable about where they position themselves as activists and as advocates. But in relation to your last question, your last point about the importance of reading and having knowledge, I think this is really fascinating because many activists talked about how often when they were going into debates with, say, policymakers or legislators, they every time they tried to make demands, the pushback was from the policymakers would say, well, until you can evidence these claims, until you can give us evidence that this is happening, we won't do anything about it. And I think that raises a really important point about, on the one hand, recognizing the importance of voice and stories that people have and experiences that may not be well documented, but at the same time, making sure that where there are resources to document and capture experiences such as research bodies or civil societies who are working on reports and projects, is that there are more relationships made with activist networks so that we can utilize our resources in terms of research and findings and make sure that they are accessible so that people can use them in different ways to enact change, but also making sure that activists are part of setting the agenda within research and within the writings that we're all doing, so that when you say, you know, these are the priorities that matter, the research that we're doing and that we're spending lots of time doing is responding to that and making sure that the research is useful, strategically useful to activists and advocates in producing a more accessible and inclusive society.
Thank you very much, Myra. And this actually reminds me that I was recently doing a Leverhulme application, and they specifically don't want to fund advocacy projects. So I think it's quite interesting how when you want to get funding, you need to frame it and use particular keywords or not, or avoid them. And I think that's something that is quite interesting. And Elineka mentioned that they prefer using activism to advocacy. So I think there's a big discussion there to be had as well. Let's go to Constance, please. Sorry you had to wait. Constance?
Okay, so mine is a concern. Because during the course of the presentation, I heard you saying disabled people, and speaking from where I stay in Nigeria, we've gotten to the point where we no longer use that term disabled people, but we use persons with disabilities, because we use the UNCRPD to guide our terminologies, because we feel that if you want to advocate for issues, you should be very familiar with some certain terminologies. But then my concern is this: since we have disparity in terminologies from region to region, because we use persons with disabilities and you use disabled people, can we have a uniformity of terms? Because sometimes people go online to source for information, and then let's say they come across my page and I refer to persons with disabilities, and they come to another page and someone says disabled people, and there's an argument between two persons with disabilities on terminology. So since this is going to be published, it's also going to be visible or available to a larger audience. Can we come together to actually pick a right terminology to address persons with disabilities that we represent? Thank you.
Thanks, Constance. I think it's a really complex and important question to highlight, and I think that I suppose on a personal level, I'm always saddened when those fights do emerge between different communities who are saying this is the right language, this is the wrong language, and so on. Initially, I suppose I'm a little bit scared about this. The idea of coming up with one terminology that suits, because of the divergence across the globe in terms of people's local experiences. For me, what I want to do, and what I always do in my research and my activism as well, is to, when this issue comes up, is to say, well, I use this terminology for various reasons, and on the surface I use it because most of my disability politics is aligned with what we refer to as a social model of disability, and that typically uses a disability first language. But I would never ever want anybody to be forced to use certain terminologies. Rather, I would want people to feel comfortable using the terminology that they want to use, and I would hope that we would get to a point where we may be talking about themes associated with injustice and accessibility and inclusion, but we may be using different terms to get to that point. And I'm really saddened when we do see those fights between different communities who are saying, you have to use this language over this language. I think, when we refer to the UNCRPD and people are using person first language, I want to embrace that, because the person who's talking, what the person is saying behind that terminology is often that wanting to produce a better world for people. And irrespective of the language I may use to do that, we are on the same ground in terms of wanting a better world, which is more just and fair and safe. And I would just hope that when I use disabled first language, that people recognize that. But often what I do in my writing is I always put a statement out at the beginning of publications, typically in books or projects for global audiences, where I always say, as an author, I'm using this phrasing and terminology, but I want you to process this information using the terms that are most comfortable to you. And I think it's about the respect and recognition that we need to try to instill in our activist networks, to say we may be using different language, but really what matters is the principles of inclusion and participation and accessibility that we're trying to achieve. I think it's such a complex issue that I share your kind of concern, absolutely, and I see it almost on a daily basis. But it's for me, it's quite sad that we have those occurrences of fights between people, rather than the focus of what we're trying to achieve, which is highlighting injustice, highlighting the violence experienced by disabled people and people with disabilities across the globe, and thinking about the alternative for protection and for ensuring communities can flourish and have opportunities to thrive.
Thank you very much, Marion. I think this is where our network can really create a good dialogue between these different factions that use different terms and promote understanding between why different terms are being used, rather than these factions being divided, because like you said, there's a common cause there, so it shouldn't be jeopardized by the use of different terms. Are there any more comments or questions? Okay, I'm aware of time, but I would like to pick up one question or one issue that's emerged in the chats, which was cultural barriers in Africa, specific barriers in Africa to disability activism. Would anyone like to comment on that? What are some of the specific obstacles that Africans or East Africans encounter? Anyone would like to comment on that?
Yes, can I?
Yes, sure, Constance.
Okay, so for Africa, the barriers we face is as a result of culture. Different cultures have the different understandings of disability, and that molds the perceptions they have when it comes to the different clusters of disability. So culture is one of the barriers that we face in Africa. Like for me as a person with albinism in Nigeria, now we have 36 states, including the FCT, and we have geopolitical zones. We have the Southeast, the Southwest, and so on and so forth. Now, how a person in the South view a person with albinism is different from a person from the Southeast, is different from a person from the North Central because of cultural diversity. So it's quite limiting for easy penetration of different clusters of disability to go into different geographical zones in the country because of the cultural diversity. So that in itself impose a barrier for us.
Okay, can I just ask to elaborate in terms of culture? What do you mean exactly by culture? Traditions, religion, gender stereotypes?
Yes, tradition, religion. Okay, so some traditional beliefs. Now we know that beliefs are passed from generations to generation. So for the Southwest, which is majorly the Yorubas, they believe that a person with albinism possess powers, supernatural powers, and they should be worshipped. That is a traditional belief. Now, moving to the north, they believe that a person with albinism is not meant to be alive, is a taboo. So, and these beliefs are passed down from generations. So that's what forms part of, culture is the people's way of life. So that forms part of what they do, what they believe in, and it also translates to how they interact and interface when they meet those persons with certain kinds of disabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Constance. I think Brenda had her hand up, but it's now down again. Brenda, did you want to continue?
I just wanted to elaborate on what Constance was saying, that the culture, she meant the beliefs and the myths, the perceptions people have around disability. And I love the example she has been talking about, because this is also applying to Uganda, where they think, in addition to what she has said, people think maybe if you have sexual intercourse with a person with albinism, you'll get cured of HIV. If you use hair or teeth or nails of a person with albinism for witchcraft, you will possess wealth and all that. So people have different perceptions about and people think that when you produce a child with any any disability, then you are cast by God. So it is more of a punishment to some of them. Others take it, for example, they say if you wake up in the morning and you meet a person with a disability, then that is a bad omen. It will be a bad day. You have to first go back home and shower and change clothes and do everything. So these perceptions and the negative attitudes about disability are really a very, very hindering and factor and barrier to activism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. As a last point, Mara, would you like to comment on that? Were there any cultural similarities or differences in terms of disability activism in Europe that you noticed?
Well, all I would say is the issue of culture was highlighted, particularly in the interviews. People spoke about how cultural traditions and perspectives within their communities. And again, this is I have in the study we have participants from Eastern Europe, from Central Europe, across a range of north and geographical spaces. So there was issues of culture, particularly in terms of family dynamics, in terms of issues of shame and stigma arose. I think what is important and I think is captured in the comments that have been made is that in thinking through our conceptualization of a better world, we have to engage and interrogate the cultural premise upon which we understand disability and the way in which we think about either through the stigmatization that is placed on disabled people, or thinking about ensuring that disabled people are recognized as valued human beings who require safety and participation as much as anybody. And I think that culture has to be a significant aspect of our activism and advocacy, just as much as when people are emphasizing issues of economics or political aspects as well. For me, we need to think about what constitutes social world organization, what contributes to the organization of societies, and politics and economics and social and cultural arrangements and structures are all coalescing within each other and are manifesting with each other. And these are the things that we have to grapple with as activists in order to make sense of the problems, as well as think about the alternatives that we want to propose.
Okay, thank you very much, Marion. I think, again, this highlights the issue of intersectionality and how important it is to identify and analyze different social identities to disability, like religion, culture, gender, and so forth. Okay, can you please all join me in saying a big thank you to Mauro for his time and his excellent presentation and insights. Thank you so much, Mauro. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to all the participants and the exciting discussions. I'm just going to finish the recording now.